Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking with Alex Hutchinson. He is a science journalist who writes about endurance, health, and fitness. Before becoming a journalist, he worked as a physicist and competed for the Canadian team in track, cross-country, road running, and mountain running. Today we're discussing his book, Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca. I appreciate it.
So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I was a competitive runner, as you mentioned, and so I think this all started for me with wondering what my limits were as a runner, and you know, I guess why I couldn't run faster or how fast I could ultimately run. But it's something I ended up. So I started with that in mind, but it's something I ended up pursuing, this idea of the limits of endurance, for about a decade as a journalist and while writing this book. And over that time, it became a much broader question for me, not just how fast could I run, but I ended up defining endurance as the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. And you know, that's not just about running a marathon. That's about being up all night with a sick child or you know, studying for an exam. I think it's an experience that's a sort of a part of life, a part of humanity. And so it started with running, but I think, yeah, as I said, it became a much broader topic as I went on.
Well, you know, I definitely agree with you. Like, you know, I've never been a competitive athlete, but having been sick and pretty much bedridden for many years, the stories that I read were almost the same. Even though you were talking a lot about athletes, it was pushing yourself past what you think that you can do. And I look back now, and I don't know how I did any of that. Because if I have a bad day now, I mean, I'm pretty normal most of the time. So I can barely, you know, handle it. Whereas back then, you know, I could put up with a lot more, which, you know, you discuss a lot of that in your book about how we can, you know, push ourselves past these limits that we think are there and that are, you know, written in science that should be there.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the parallels between, you know, endurance for someone who's ill and endurance for an athlete, and we often put those in separate boxes. But there's a huge amount of commonality. And one of the researchers, probably the researcher who figures most prominently in the book, is a guy named Samuele Marcora. He's an Italian researcher who now works in England, who's done some really, really interesting research on understanding the nature of fatigue. And he didn't get into this because he was an ex-marathon runner or anything like that. He got into it because his mother was ill. His mother had a serious kidney disease and ended up on dialysis. And so the dialysis controls the physical problems associated with her kidney failure, but she still struggled, and many patients with her condition struggle with sort of crushing fatigue that interferes with just the day-to-day tasks of living. And so Marcora was a physiologist in a different area, but he decided he couldn't understand why there was this disconnect between the physical symptoms that his mother had, which seemed to be addressed, and her experience of living, which was still very difficult. So he reinvented himself as a physiologist, trying to understand the nature of fatigue, and specifically trying to understand the brain's role in how we experience and how we interpret fatiguing tasks. So I think the parallels are very clear. And actually, in another section in the book, I talk about there's research into something called transcranial direct current stimulation. So it's basically running a weak electric current through your brain, and there's some pretty interesting research today showing that it can change your endurance. So this is another sign that endurance is controlled by your brain if you can send electric current through your brain and change your physical endurance. But anyway, the point is, the researchers who are doing this, they come from the perspective of stroke rehabilitation and Parkinson's, trying to help people cope with physical limitations. And again, the challenges that someone who's suffered a stroke and is trying to learn to walk again, the challenges that person faces are not just similar, they're fundamentally the same as the challenges that a marathon runner faces trying to run a little bit faster. It's trying to convince your muscles they can do something that you have the perception that you can't do. But if you can alter your perspective in some way or change what's going on in your brain, it turns out you may actually have that physical capacity.
So when we're talking about this and we're talking about endurance, I mean, I think we all know what that means in the term of, you run a race and you have the endurance to do that. But, in your book, you talk about a broader spectrum. I mean, some of your examples, climbing the Arctic or climbing Mount Everest and, going to the Arctic and all that kind of stuff are of course beyond what I do in my everyday and is probably more extreme examples. But what is the definition of endurance and what does that mean for us?
Yeah, this was actually a really tricky thing to sort out. And you'd think I would have figured out what endurance was before I started writing a book about it, but actually it was sort of halfway through the research process, I sort of realized, I have to really narrow down what I mean by the word endurance, because it means different things to different people. And, running a marathon, yes. Spending 3 months trying to haul a sled across the Antarctic. Well, yeah, I think that requires endurance. But then at the other end of the spectrum, it's like, you look at Usain Bolt. He's a sprinter. He sprints for 10 seconds. But why is he one of the greatest sprinters in the world? Well, every sprinter, when they run 100 meters, they start to slow down usually. They reach their peak speed around 60 meters, and then they start to slow down. They can't maintain their peak speed for the entire 10 seconds of the race. And Bolt maintains his peak speed a little bit longer than most of his rivals. So in a way, you could argue that Usain Bolt is great because he has great endurance for a sprinter. So what I realized is it's really hard to sort of say, well, endurance takes place between, 1 minute and 5 hours or something like that. That's not really sufficient. To me, it's too restrictive. To me, endurance is something that, well, one thing that's sort of essential to it is the feeling of time passing. So it's not just being willing to be uncomfortable, because I could say punch me in the face, and that would be stupid. But it would also you could say that someone has great self-control or anything if they're willing to allow themselves to be punched in the face. But that doesn't take endurance, because it just happens in a split second. So you have to be willing to endure, kind of hold your finger in the flame to talk about endurance. And so, as I said, the general definition that I ended up settling on is that endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. And that, that can take place over the course of a minute or an hour or a day or a month. Or, another example that I think of, because I've been traveling a bunch lately, is, sitting on a plane in a really cramped seat, being uncomfortable, and, maybe there's crying babies all around you and so on. There's or maybe it's studying for an exam, being able to maintain your focus and keep doing what you're trying to do to struggle against the mounting desire for whatever reason to stop. It requires endurance. And this, I should emphasize that it kind of feels like I'm mixing lots of different things together, and, that the similarities between studying for an exam and running a marathon are just sort of metaphorical. But what I came away from this book feeling is that actually it's not just a metaphor, that fundamentally it is the same task. The mental strength you require to, force yourself to keep studying for the exam or to keep pushing the pace in your marathon, that is the same. Those are the same mental traits, and I think they're transferable. If you get better at one, you probably get better at others. And the mental aspect of endurance, I think, is fundamental to physical endurance. Because of course, to run a marathon, you also need to train your body, right? Like you have to have a strong heart and strong legs and so on. But in the middle of a marathon, no one is running at their physical limits. No one is sprinting as hard as they can. So it's fundamentally still, even in those contexts, it's still a mental challenge to get the most out of yourself. So that's a bit of a rambling answer, sorry, but yeah, that's
well. It obviously that shows how complicated it actually is. That it's not just this straightforward it is this, it is, like you said, pushing beyond the desire to stop, which I think we've all been there. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't done that, whether it's just to get up in the morning or to run a marathon. These can be difficult things depending on what's going on in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think it's a sort of, for better or worse, it's a fundamental part of the human condition. And so, I sometimes talk to people about these ideas, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not an athlete," and I say, "Well, look, maybe not, but I guarantee you've pushed your limits of endurance in some context of your life. We all have come across that struggle in different ways."
So when we're talking about, some people being able to maintain their endurance for longer than the 10 seconds, why are some people different and can do that and some can't? Is that something that we understand?
Well, we have some pretty good understanding of the factors. There's not one simple answer. There's a lot of different things that go into endurance. And one thing I would say is, so in the book, and also I talk a lot about what's interesting to me is the mental side of endurance. But this doesn't mean that the physical side is not important too. So if you asked me, if you took 100 random people off the street and asked me to predict which of them was going to finish a marathon fastest, or what order they would finish a marathon in, my first sort of attempt to figure things out would be to take them to an exercise physiology lab and run some tests on things like their maximal oxygen intake or their uptake, which is a measure of how quickly they can take oxygen from the air, breathe it into their lungs, transport it into their bloodstream, and get it to their muscles. Oxygen's really important. And there's other things you can look at, like how efficient their muscles are. And these sorts of physical traits, excuse me, they're what separate. They're the biggest thing that separate, an Olympic marathon from meet. But that's not enough. So definitely these physical things like the efficiency of the muscles and ability to use oxygen matter. And some of that stuff is that's definitely physical training builds those capabilities. But also some people are born with greater oxygen usage capacities than others. But if you look at any sort of similar group of people, like if you take all the people in the Olympic marathon, they all have very similar physical traits at that point. And at that point, you could spend all day in a lab or all month in a lab running tests, and you still wouldn't be able to figure out who was going to win the race. So once you talk about evenly matched people, then you start to the mental side becomes the more crucial distinguishing factor. So there's definitely some obvious physical things that we can look at that tell the difference between someone who has amazing physical endurance and someone who has more normal physical endurance. But that only takes you so far. That only tells you part of the story.
So when we're looking at this, one thing I found interesting in your book was that death by endurance was rare, you said. And I'm just wondering if we know why that is, why we don't push ourselves to those limits all the time. I mean, when I thought about it, I'm like, well, yeah, that's normal, because otherwise we wouldn't just, we wouldn't go to bed. We would just keep pushing ourselves, right? So why is it that it's so rare for us to push ourselves way beyond that capacity?
Yeah, this is a really interesting sort of insight that a South African scientist named Tim Noakes pointed out to me. He sort of thought about this in the mid 1990s. He was giving a really important exercise physiology lecture in 1996, an honorary lecture, and he was trying to think of something interesting to say. And it occurred to him that, yes, some people reach their limits, and occasionally someone dies while they're climbing Mount Everest or running a marathon in hot conditions or something. But the really odd thing when you think about it is that it's so rare that people almost never do. And one of the things he does, Tim Noakes likes to do in his talks, he'll put up a slide showing a picture of the gold and silver medalists from the 1996 Olympic marathon, which was won by a South African. That's why he likes it, because he's from South Africa. But you have these two guys, one from South Africa, one from South Korea, jogging around the track waving their flags. And he'll say, look at that guy in second place. Look at the silver medalist. What do you notice about him? He's not dead. And that means he could have gone faster. So this is a guy who came second by 3 seconds in the Olympic marathon. So he had every incentive to push himself to his absolute maximum. Sporting immortality awaited if he could go just 3 seconds faster. But he couldn't. And yet, when he crossed the line, he was able to keep jogging. So obviously his muscles hadn't reached some limit where they didn't work anymore. And when you think about it, like around the globe on any given Sunday, there's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people running marathons or doing bike races or hiking or doing all sorts of things where they're trying to push themselves as hard as they can, and yet they can't seem to do any damage to themselves. If I went out the door right now and decided to run myself unconscious, I wouldn't be able to. I'd be too tired before I was able to do any serious damage to myself. So Noakes started thinking about this and said, why is this? Why can we not hurt ourselves? Because sometimes it would be nice to be able to push a little harder. If you're being chased by a lion or whatever, you don't want anything holding you back. But Noakes' theory, which he called the central governor, is that through evolution or for whatever reason, we're wired in a way that prevents us from reaching our absolute physical limits, or at least tries to prevent us from reaching our absolute physical limits. That when you reach the point you can't go any farther, it's not because your muscles have absolutely maxed out or your heart is about to explode. It's because your brain wants to make sure that doesn't happen. And you can think about, that it kind of makes sense that we would end up being wired this way, because if, like you said, if you had no signal to make you stop, you would just, keep chasing that antelope, 50,000 years ago across the savannah until you fell flat on your face and died, and then you wouldn't pass on your genes to your ancestors, or to your descendants rather. So this idea of the central governor, that where the brain is always holding you back from the absolute physical limits, where you might actually push yourself to death, it's been controversial for the last 20 years, and there's lots of debate about it. And I think there's not a whole lot of agreement on exactly how the brain holds us back or what the actual circuitry is. But there's pretty broad agreement now that we are wired in a way that makes it very, very hard for anyone to push themselves to a truly dangerous point. Which is not to say it doesn't happen, right? Like, and I talk about some of these examples in my book of, like a guy who was trying to walk unaided across Antarctica, hauling a 300-pound sled with no backup and no help, who ended up after 70 days basically just sort of collapsing and dying of massive organ failure, even though he had plenty of food and he wasn't cold or anything like that. So it can happen, but it's really, really rare, because we seem to have some pretty good protective circuitry, which in some cases may go haywire. Maybe sometimes for some people it becomes too protective, and we get getting the signals to slow down even when there's no reason to slow down.
That makes sense. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about this more when we get back. We're talking today with Alex Hutchinson, and we're discussing his book, Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. We'll be back shortly.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
The largest syndicated alternative health talk program has come to the Voice America Network. The Dr. Bob Martin Show is the program that will answer your health questions and help you to heal your own body of many different ailments. Each week, you'll hear the answers that Dr. Bob gives to his callers that help them to be their own doctor most of the time. We'll also discuss developments on the healthcare front and what you need to do to keep your body in top form. The Dr. Bob Martin Show airs Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
The Voice America Live Events channel is here now to showcase your corporate, individual, or organization's live event. Visit voiceamerica.com/live events to see all of our past live events and find out more. Whether it's a multi-day conference, special speaker, or single-day event, we've got everything to make your event a success. We can do a few hours or a few days. For more information about taking your event to the next level, call Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or email info@voiceamerica.com. Again, that's Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or send us an email to info@voiceamerica.com. Voice America is where you are and where you want to be. Join us around the globe as we broadcast live from some of the most interesting events available. Don't forget to view all our live events, including on-demand access to past events that you may have missed by visiting voiceamerica.com/live events.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're talking today with Alex Hutchinson, and we're discussing his book, Endure. So, Alex, we talked about, what these personal limits are for everybody and that we all have them and we're pushing past them. But is there a way that we can actually change that?
Yeah, that's the inevitable question, right? Like if you start thinking about limits, you say, okay, well, how can I tap into this hidden reserve? So the short answer is, I think, yes, it is possible to change these limits. It's harder than you might think, and it's not a sort of, there's no like press a button and you suddenly have access to hidden power. But there's a number of ways that scientists have shown both. There's some methods in the lab that you can use to alter the limits on your quote unquote central governor that kind of demonstrate the fact that it exists. And so an example of that would be, for example, studies using subliminal images. So you put some cyclists in a lab and ask them on a stationary bike and ask them to pedal for as long as they can at a given pace or power. On the wall in front of them, you have images of either a smiling face or a frowning face that just flash for a brief, 16 milliseconds at a time. So you're not even aware that there are pictures in front of you. They're totally invisible, and you only perceive them unconsciously. And cyclists can, and in one study at least, they lasted 12% longer when they were unconsciously being shown smiling faces rather than frowning faces. So that's the kind of an example of something where since they didn't even know that this was happening, it's not like a placebo effect because they didn't know that they were being manipulated. And so the thinking is that what's happening there is what matters is not so much, it doesn't matter what your lactate levels in your legs are, or what your heart rate is. I mean, or at least those things don't matter directly. You don't stop because your heart rate has reached a maximum. You stop or you slow down because of how your brain is interpreting all those signals. Your brain is kind of assessing, how are we doing? How far do we need to go? Is this sustainable? Should we slow down? And so in a sense, what the smiling faces seem to do is just help nudge our brain to have a more optimistic interpretation of those same signals from the rest of the body, whether it's the heart rate or lactate or your body temperature. You just sort of, you assess that and say, oh, it's okay. You're in a slightly happier place. And so for practical purposes, subliminal messages are not a particularly useful thing to think about. We're not going to start flashing, smiling faces everywhere. But that insight points to the fact that your internal monologue really matters. The words that are going through your head during stressful times, they are also influencing how your brain interprets signals from the rest of your body. So in the sports context, because that's a sort of an easy way of thinking about this, or a sort of simple real life context. If you're running a marathon and halfway through you're saying to yourself, "Oh, this hurts so much. I can't do this. There's no way I can keep going. I'm going to have to slow down. I'm going to have to stop." Those thoughts are then affecting how your brain is interpreting how your legs are feeling, how your heart rate is doing, how your body temperature is doing. And if you can recognize that internal monologue, recognize the things you're telling yourself, and kind of analyze it and say, is this true? Are these justified thoughts? And in some cases they're not going to be justified. You're going to be overly negative or pessimistic. And so you can then come up with alternatives. What should I be saying to myself halfway through a marathon? And if you're saying to yourself, I can do this, I've prepared for this, I am as good as anybody else here at enduring through this, I'm going to keep going, that will change your interpretation, like the smiling faces, so that you're then able to basically endure the same amount or endure more physical, a greater physical effort without having it feel harder. So you're able to keep going for longer. And this kind of thing is called motivational self-talk training, and it's been around for decades or longer. It's something sports psychologists have worked with for a long time, and it's sort of very intuitive. But what's new in the last few years is that physiologists have started to say, hey, this is actually, we need to be able to incorporate the brain into our understanding of human limits. So let's test motivational self-talk training, where we give people a couple of weeks of training in how to change their internal monologues. And what they're finding is, it really does, in laboratory conditions, allow you to enhance your endurance. So that's a big takeaway for me, is you can change it. You can change your brain settings, not necessarily by hooking up your brain to a machine, but by taking care of your thoughts and your internal monologue.
Well, one example from your book, and I'll let you tell the story better, was a lady who had brain surgery, and she didn't have any short-term memory. So she wasn't able to remember where she was in her journey. Would that be kind of on? Yeah, I'll let you talk about that.
This is a really interesting sort of real-world illustration of how this plays out. Excuse me. It's a woman named Diane Van Daren. She's an ultramarathon runner, but her ultramarathon career and she's very, very accomplished. But her career only started after she had brain surgery at the age of 37. She had very severe epilepsy. She had really debilitating seizures. So she had surgery to remove a small kind of golf ball-sized chunk of her brain where the seizures were originating. And there's always some collateral damage in that kind of surgery. And for her, it took the form of compromising her sense of time and her sense of place, so that she didn't have, she was no longer as well able to keep track of how long things were taking, where she was going. And what's interesting is that she wasn't an ultramarathon runner before this surgery at age 37. She'd never competed in a marathon or in an ultramarathon, but what she found is she was really good at it after surgery, and she started by running like a 50K or a 50 miler, I think it was, and then she was doing multi-day events. And then in her early 50s, she actually set a record on a trail that goes all the way across North Carolina. So it took her I think it was 22 days or so, and she was running something like 22 hours a day for more than 3 weeks, just pushing herself absolutely to her limit. She ran the fastest ever time on traversing this trail across North Carolina. And the thing was, she had this, it's kind of it's a blessing and a curse, you could say. It's not that she didn't suffer. She pushing herself like that was extremely painful, but she didn't have, to the same extent as the rest of us, it seems, this sort of control system where for most of us, our brains are constantly assessing, how far have we come? How far do we have to go? Where do we stand in terms of, controlling our resources to make sure we don't run out of gas or push ourselves too hard? So for her, she just always has a weaker sense of how far she's come and how far she still has to go. So at one point she said something like, I could be out running for 2 weeks, and if someone said, hey, there's a race that starts tomorrow, I'd be like, let's go. Because for her, it's always the present moment. She's not calculating what the body might be able to do tomorrow or in an hour. She's just responding to what her body can do right now. And so it turns out that's a very powerful way of running and of getting the most out of yourself, a powerful and painful way of being able to push your body, because you're only worried about, can you keep going right now, not can you keep going in the future. So I don't think she would voluntarily. I don't think anyone would voluntarily choose to have that happen or to have those deficits. But for her, it certainly turned her into an amazing ultra runner, and allowed her to kind of demonstrated how the brain has these sort of subtle effects on our abilities.
Well, it definitely does. And, when you're talking about it, it sounds like a lot of people are trying to achieve that, because you described mindfulness and meditation, where we try to be in the moment and only experience this, which I think it is very difficult to do, because, when you're sitting doing something, you're like, okay, but then later I have to do this and this task, which obviously she isn't thinking about. She's just running, she's not burdened with all of that other stuff that the rest of us are.
Yeah, and again, she might, in other contexts, she might like it, but she might like to have those abilities, but it's a gift. I sort of think of it it's like I sit here trying to do work at my computer, and I get endlessly distracted by checking Twitter and things like that. And if you took away my internet connection, I wouldn't necessarily be happier. I'd be, hey, I need my internet. But I'd probably be a much more productive writer. I'd get a lot more words on the page if you took away that internet connection, because it's taking me out of the moment of the task of writing. Whereas if without that distraction, so she's kind of lost that ability, which is a mixed blessing. And because we all know, like to go back to your point, I know perfectly well that checking Twitter every 20 minutes is not helpful to me as a runner, in the same way that I know that cultivating mindfulness, or as a writer rather, in the same way that I know that cultivating mindfulness is good for me, probably as an athlete, probably as a writer, probably as a human being, like cultivating that sense of mindfulness. I know it's good. It's just hard to do because we have all these other things tugging at our attention. And so she has maybe fewer things tugging at her attention, and she's able to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Which is something I think just special for her. I think that talking about trying to move forward and becoming a good athlete, or just enduring your challenge in your life. Not all of us, as you said, are going to have the deficits that she has. So working on the brain, like you said, it's not easy to do that either, to look at, we're not going to walk around all staring ahead and I'll see these happy faces ahead of us. So we're still going to have whatever we have going on in our own brain, I guess, in our way, and becoming a challenge, as well as the physical aspect of our own bodies. Yeah,
and I would say, like, one of the things that I really want to make clear, so look, I wrote a book that's all about the mental side of endurance. And of course, I talk a little bit about ways of sort of surmounting the mental barriers. It's always tempting to try and oversell how powerful those techniques are, and to say, hey, read my book and I guarantee you're going to be, life is going to be easy. You're going to learn these three tricks that are going to allow you to totally surpass your mental limits. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. Like, I think understanding and thinking about the mental aspect of endurance is a really powerful and important way of understanding whatever challenges you're facing. And I think some of the stuff I describe in the book, the stuff like motivational self-talk and mindfulness and those sorts of things, are powerful techniques, but they are not sort of easy or simple fixes that you just press a button and things get a lot better. They're sort of journeys. And I would say for myself, I've learned a lot from writing this book, but I'm not sort of speaking from the top of the mountain where everything is easy now. It's more just a question of understanding. Like, seeing someone like Diane Van Daren, you see, okay, I understand now what the role of those sorts of distractions and how they can hold me back more than they should. But it's still a long process to try, and a slow process to try and build my own mindset in a direction where I can push beyond what my limits might have been previously.
Well, and not most of us aren't going to have the brain surgery the way she has had, that are going to allow us to run for 22 hours in a day because we can't remember how long we've been running. So, to deal with our everyday life when we have the memory and we have the knowledge of what's going to happen if we push past something, for people that are chronically ill, that could mean the next 3 days they're too tired, or it's the same with running a marathon. I'm sure that takes a toll, where there seems to be, from reading your book as well, that there's something that stops us from pushing past all of that to a certain degree.
Yeah, and in a way, one of the things that one of the ultimate goals, I guess, is to start trying to distinguish between the feeling that you shouldn't do something, the feeling that you can't do something, and the actuality of you being unable to do it. And feelings are real, and they have power in us. But as you want to start, because sometimes we really can't do something. Like if you're running a marathon, there are things that you can't just sprint a marathon. Your mind does not allow you to just sprint a marathon as fast as you can. That's not the way life works. So you want to start trying to distinguishing between the sort of orange lights and the red lights, and starting to be able to see the difference and between when you can push a little, keep pushing a little, and when you really do have to respect that signal that you've gone as far as you can for now. So it's more, it's not like a quick fix or anything. It's more just a kind of trying to understand more about the nature of the barriers that we encounter.
That makes sense. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking today with Alex Hutchinson, and we're discussing his book, Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. We'll be back shortly.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Take us on the go. It's even easier now. The Voice America Talk Radio Network has launched our mobile app for iPhone, Android, or BlackBerry. Visit the Apple iTunes App Store, BlackBerry App World, or Android Market to download the app powered by Aircast. It's free and no registration is necessary. In minutes, you could be enjoying your favorite Voice America Talk Radio host, no matter where you are, in the car, out and about, while traveling, or anytime you can't be close to your computer. Catch up on the archives you've missed or discover new shows on the spot. Search Voice America at your favorite app store.
What causes us to be sick? We're not talking about the actual illness or the scientific cause of illnesses. We're talking about your body and health. Listen for the healing whisper of return to peace. Each week, host Dr. Marianne Chase shows you how to listen to your heart to identify poor health, stress, and disease. You'll learn how to heal energetically and spiritually, as well as physically. It's time to depend less on the drugs and more on the heart. The Healing Whisper airs live every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
Follow the Voice America Talk Radio Network on Twitter. We're at Voice America TRN. You'll get the latest fix on what's happening with our shows, this week's featured guests, and general happenings that you should know about at the Voice America Talk Radio Network. Now you don't have to miss anything when you're away from your home or office. Just go to twitter.com/Voice America TRN or follow along with us at Voice America TRN, the Voice America Talk Radio Network. We're on the cutting edge of social media. Can you keep up?
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Alex Hutchinson, and we're discussing his book, Endure. So, Alex, when we're talking about all the physical limits, I mean, your book did focus on, sports and everything, but I know that there's is our mental capacity, the same as that? Is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Rebecca. So again, I focused a lot on the sort of physical endurance, like running a marathon, and everyone's aware that let's say you're running a marathon, you're going to when in the week before the marathon, you're going to reduce your training pretty dramatically because even though you've been training to get fitter, you need to also be fresh and well rested. And there's been a bunch of research in recent years looking at the role of mental fatigue and how it impacts even physical performance. So what they found is that if let's say you can sit at a computer for 90 minutes doing some fairly simple task. They have letters and numbers flashing on a screen, and you just have to press a button depending on which numbers or letters show up. It's not hard, but it takes some focus. After 90 minutes, if you then try and do some physical exercise, your perception of the effort required to do that exercise will be higher because you're mentally fatigued. So you'll get onto an exercise bike, start pedaling at a given pace, and you'll say, oh man, that feels like 6 out of 10 instead of like 5 out of 10, even though all you've been doing is just sitting at a computer, which is what a lot of us do most of the day. And I don't sit just for 90 minutes. I'll sit at a computer for 8 hours. And so I think oftentimes we don't really realize the toll that takes. And so from a sports perspective, the takeaway is like, if you're running a marathon, yeah, you're going to not train that much in the last week, but you should also take care to have a mental taper. You should spend your last few days before the marathon, reading something enjoyable or relaxing. It's not the time to do your taxes or something like that, and to arrive at the start of the marathon, physically fresh but mentally frazzled. And I think that's a lesson that really, applies in so many areas of life, whether it's something at work or a social occasion, whether it's Thanksgiving with the family or whatever. If you've got something that's going to tax you, either physically or mentally, you want to make sure you're starting with a full reserve, that you're not starting with a half tank of mental energy. And so I think it's really important to build in times of recovery, both after but also before things that take a lot of energy out of you.
Well, and this is something that, although it's talked about a lot on this show, is not socially accepted and personally accepted for a lot of people. A lot of people feel guilty just to take that time out. But, if we're comparing that mental fatigue to the same as a physical fatigue, after reading your book, it's obviously very important for us to have that downtime where we're going to not be able to perform at our best.
Yeah, and there's a recent book by two guys now, Brad Stolberg and Steve Magnus, called Peak Performance, and one of them is an elite track coach, and one of them is a former management consultant. So what they've done is kind of bridge these worlds of what athletes have learned over the years about peak performance with what people in business and other contexts and creative pursuits have learned about peak performance, and looking for the parallels. And their sort of fundamental point, their mantra is that stress plus rest equals growth. And most of us are good at the stress part, about pushing our bodies, pushing our minds, pushing ourselves. But what we forget is that without the rest, your body doesn't grow, it just gets more and more stressed. And I think that's a really important insight. And like you said, it's not something that's sort of built into our work lives or our personal lives. The idea that you're going to get more productivity out of me if I go home and just rest for a day, or if I don't accept any evening invitations for a week because I just need to recharge after a day of work or whatever. And it can be difficult, and it can again, and like you said, it doesn't happen naturally or get the social approval. But I think taking care of building sufficient recovery in is just such an important thing.
Well, and often overlooked. I mean, it's in North America anyway, where most jobs push themselves. I mean, where I live, people work long hours and they're expected to. And, if they show any sign of weakness, they could be at risk of losing their job. They're just expected to do that. And having gone through what I did with my own health journey, I don't do that. And there have been some comments from people in the city just because I actually don't work the normal 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job just because I need to have time for myself. But I had to get ill to learn that. And I hope that most people are listening to the show and realize that it's important before, that kind of drama in your life to take care of yourself, because after reading your book, it's obviously very important for us to understand our limits.
Yeah, I agree, and a lot of superficially what my book is about is how to push your limits, but there's a place and time for that. There's a place and time for pushing your limits, and there's a place and time for recovering it. And I would say, for me personally, at my place where I am in my career and my family life, it's a real struggle, because I think I'm aware of what of what I need to do to be happiest and healthiest, but there's a lot of pressures, both external and definitely internal pressures, on thinking I should be pushing harder, doing more, trying this, doing that, and it's not easy to turn those voices off. But I have to say, like as we were chatting about off air, my voice is actually usually like an octave higher than this. I have a cold right now, and I've been pushing hard the last few weeks, and finally on Friday, I could tell I was getting sick, and so on Friday, I was like, okay, I have to get to bed by 9:00, and so Friday and Saturday and Sunday nights I got to bed early, and it's great, and I liked it. But if I had done that a week earlier, I might not be sick right now. That was closing the barn door after it was already too late, because I'd been up later working and sorting things out for the previous week, and so. It's a shame to learn the lessons when it's too late. Even when you know the lessons, you have to get out ahead of it and recover before you're like, now I'm sick. Thanks, Alex. Why did you do that to yourself?
Yeah, it's an important lesson. I'm glad you learned that. I'm glad you could
I
point
learned
that
it every
out
2
to you.
months.
Yeah.
Hope it sticks this time.
So one thing I'm curious about, your book goes into way more detail than we even have time on the show. But after doing all of this research, as an athlete, have you been able to change anything? Increase your running time or anything like that?
Well, I'll say, one thing that the sort of factor that you have to consider is in my teens and 20s and even into my early 30s, I was competing on the Canadian national team as a distance runner. Now I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm balancing a career. So the level of training I'm at right now means that I'm not chasing the performances that I had when I was 25 years old. So no, I'm not faster than I was. Am I faster than I would be if I hadn't done this research? It's hard to say, because one thing I will say, so I've thought a lot about this, let's say I had a time machine and I could go back and give some advice to, my 20-year-old self who was, fully consumed with trying to run as fast as possible. What advice would I give? And I've spent, 10 plus years writing about the science of endurance, not just about the stuff in the book, but about every supplement you can think of, every new workout regime, every sort of approach to getting faster. And if I had this time machine, it's definitely the case that there's almost nothing I would go back and tell myself about, nutrition or supplements or performance enhancing workouts or anything like that. All that stuff is pretty marginal. It would definitely be, my focus would be on the mental stuff, like we were talking about earlier, like motivational self-talk. Now, in my current life, how am I doing with that stuff? It's a journey, and I'm early in the journey. It's one thing to recognize the importance of this stuff, but it's not like just sort of saying, okay, I now believe motivational self-talk works. Well, that doesn't do anything on its own. You have to then take the steps to become aware of what your monologue is, and then put in the work to develop alternative forms of self-talk that become second nature. And I'm not there yet, I would say. Probably the stage that I'm at is I'm a lot more aware when I'm doing things poorly, when I'm running with a big frown on my face and telling myself that I'm doomed to failure. I'm aware of that, but it's still not easy for me to switch that at the flick of a switch to something more positive.
Well, I mean, Although, it sounds like we're talking about neuroplasticity and to change those pathways, which I've talked about on the show before. And, you can't just change a pattern that you've had for 40 years, a self-talk pattern overnight just by making that decision. We don't work that way. We have those patterns for a reason. They're somehow ingrained in us for some sort of protection or some sort of something. It's something that does take time. And we know that would change with anything. So, it's no different than if I was to decide I wanted to be an athlete the way you are, I would be changing my workout regime, and it would, certainly be hard. And I think that's the same, and that's something that we forget about when we come to the mental aspect. Is it's just as hard to change anything else in our lives.
Yeah, and it's hard, and it's also the changes are invisible, so it's much harder to track our progress. And so that's why, I think it's really important to emphasize that, because the tempting thing to do is just say, okay, well, I'll give this a try. This sounds kind of crazy, but I'll try, being positive for myself. And then 2 weeks later, you haven't noticed any big changes in your life, so you're like, I don't think that really worked for me. Well, it's like, to me, it's a journey of years to sort of set yourself a goal of being, for example, being more positive, but changing whatever other pathways may be holding you back. And you have to understand that changes are going to take time, and that you shouldn't, after a few weeks, conclude that it was all a big failure. So I'm being patient with myself, I don't think even in 5 years I'll be able to say, aha, I ran 17 seconds faster for 5K because I, fixed some of my self-defeating self-talk. It's not that. These things are very hard to disentangle. And so, and for me, that's part of the reason that I never really took them seriously when I was younger. But one of the interesting things for me is in writing this book has been spending all this time immersed in the scientific literature and talking to scientists who are studying this stuff and saying, we've tested it in the lab and it works. It works under controlled conditions. So when you go home, you're not going to have those same controlled conditions. You're not going to have a lab to find out if self-talk is making you faster. But we know from the research that it works. And so if you stick with it, you should be able to see some gains.
Well, thank you. I think it's also important to know, with somebody as an athlete, I know that you're probably able to reach goals a little better than us lay people. Just having met a lot of athletes, you're a little more determined. And to know that it's still difficult for you as well can be encouraging for anybody else who's trying to work on changing their endurance and their thought pattern and anything else. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks. I agree. It's important to not oversell it and by making it sound easy. Maybe I'd sell a few more books, but if I claimed that I had an easy solution, but the problem is that it just, like you said, it rebounds in the opposite direction and makes people frustrated when it turns out that it's not easy. It's a journey for all of us.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if anybody has any questions or wants to find your book, how can they go about doing so?
Probably the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. My handle there is Sweat Science, all one word, Sweat Science. And anytime I have new articles and things like that, I post there and I try and respond to comments there too. I do have a website, alexhutchinson.net, where there's more detail on me and links to my books and stuff like that. But Twitter or alexhutchinson.net are good places to find me.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for joining me today. I enjoyed the show.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciated the conversation.
And I want to thank everybody for listening. Today we were talking with Alex Hutchinson. We were discussing his book, Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. Thanks for listening, and be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We'll talk more next week.